The Mafia was a criminal gangster organization of Italian members who basically ruled over the country in the 80s. The 80s was the golden era for the Mafia, and New York was the seat of their power. They controlled absolutely everything in New York, from fish markets, restaurants, transportation, fish products, transportation of products, controlling the garment industry, hospitals, to ship docks. They even had the power to put judges on the bench for them. The mob had 5 most powerful families: the Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, Lucchese, and the Bonanno family. These bosses were powerful because they were big into loan sharking, drug dealing, human trafficking, and gambling. The families were ruled by bosses and underbosses, and no one was convicted of anything for murder. Another big thing that made the mob so powerful was that they owned other Teamster unions. The unions that they own are also known to be the most powerful unions in the Americas. They control the labor unions, longshoremen unions, hotel employee unions, and the trucking union. The mafia controlled everything, and no one had anything on them. Sure, the FBI could convict people in the mafia, but they were just little guys in a big organization. If a murder happened, the FBI knew nothing about why it happened and what the connections were. They saw a man they thought was suspicious on the street. All they could do was take a picture. The FBI had no power in the country. Right here is G. Robert Blakely. The FBI heard about the creation of the RICO case, which he created, and this gave the federal justice system the ability to prosecute all individuals in an organization. But how were they going to do that? They needed evidence. They decided to bug the bosses of the mafia, or people who couldn't keep their mouth shut in the mafia. So they had about 25 different wiretaps going on at once. They had wiretaps going on in their houses, in their phones, their lamps, and their cars. This is Paulie Castellano, who many called at that time the white-collar killer. He was so dangerous because he had the ability to kill someone without being called a killer. When they bugged Castellano, this was a major event for the FBI, because this was their first time bugging one of the major crime bosses of one of the biggest powerful families. Right here is his bodyguard, who was a killer. Right here is Tony Dux Corallo, who was an old, cagey, old-fashioned fellow. You really couldn't tell he was a crime boss by the way, just from the looks at him. But he was a murderer. He had a chauffeur and the car was bugged. But back then the FBI didn't have top-of-the-line equipment, so they had to tail the car to get the signal of the conversation, which was a scary situation for the FBI. Guerrero Langella was the crime boss for the Colombo family. He owned the Casa Storta restaurant, which the FBI soon enough bugged. The challenge, though, was bugging him was that he had a 150-pound mastiff guarding the place. Right here is Fat Tony, who was the crime boss of the biggest powerful family in America in the 80s, the Genovese family. He had a schedule. He would go in the Palmas Boys Social Club for Monday and come out Thursday. While he was in there, neighbors would go in there hoping he could help in whatever way. He was basically God to those people. One day, they saw Tony Dux meeting with Fat Tony. This gave the realization to the FBI that the crime bosses had more contact with each other than they predicted. They figured out that the 5 bosses formed a commission. They started hearing about XLO and Northbury into the conversations, and which were street corners with huge construction sites for skyscrapers. Ralphie Scopo was the president of the construction union, and he scared everybody into doing what the mob wanted. These construction sites that they were creating were $1 million deals, and there were construction sites going up everywhere in Manhattan. Soon the FBI started forming a case against the mafia. Conspiracies of the mafia owning all the buildings in Manhattan were being proven true, and they were getting enough wiretaps and surveillance on the family. This right here is how the people used to listen to the wiretappings. They would go over and over to make sure to things, whatever. But they had to prove that the mob was its own enterprise and that the individuals in the organization wanted to be there. So they had to prove Anthony Indelicato was a killer, and he was the one who assassinated crime boss. So the FBI looked at palm prints in his car. That was enough to prove that the commission was a real thing that they had ordered killed. One day, one of the informants of the FBI told them that the commission was having a meeting. This had to be a day for the FBI to get the commission all together, but they had to be secretive in the surveillance. They arrived an hour later than when the meeting started. and finally got a picture of every crime boss coming out of the house. This was the last piece of evidence that the FBI needed. They had to arrest the bosses the next day because the story had leaked to the news and that they were going to go on air saying that the crime bosses were going to be arrested. They arrested every crime boss before they were lost in the wind and while in custody. That was when Big Polly learned his house had been bugged. Rudolph Giuliani was the prosecutor on the case for the mob. He had been following the story case a while and was ready to put the case into action when they took all the crime bosses into custody. Him and his family started receiving death threats from the mob, which made him and his assistant have to learn how to use a gun, which he had never used before. While all the buzz was happening, a story got out that Big Polly had been shot and killed execution style. This was devastating for the FBI because they had formed so much evidence that they kind of formed a connection with the man. He was shot. They say that he was shot by John Gotti. During the Supreme Court case, the prosecution had to persuade all 12 jurors, while the defendant had to only persuade one juror to win. This put the prosecution on edge because they had to make sure that they were getting to every single juror, so they would watch the body language if they were listening, making eye contact, engrossed, or anything else. It took 4 days for the verdict by the jury, and these 4 days were nerve-wracking for the prosecution. They didn't know if the mafia had gotten to one of the jurors, but soon the verdict was guilty, and the relief was felt among the FBI and the prosecution. This opened the avenue to convict many more high-ranked criminals in the later years.
It was 6:42.